They saw a black woman in first class and decided she didn't belong there. Before the plane even left the gate, security was walking down the aisle, past businessmen, past vacationing families, until they stopped right in front of her. Within minutes, whispers spread. Phone started recording. And despite her calm composure, she was escorted off the aircraft like a threat. What no one around her knew was that she wasn't just another passenger. She was a powerhouse in the world of finance. A woman whose signature could move billions. A leader whose company had ties to the very airline now humiliating her in front of hundreds of strangers. They thought they were removing a problem. They had no idea they were grounding their own future. Because what happened after that plane door closed would cost the airline more than a public apology. It would cost them billions. The question is, how do you recover from a mistake that powerful? For most of her life, she had been underestimated. From the moment she stepped into the world of finance, she learned that excellence had to be undeniable. Degrees from top universities, years of 12-hour days, boardrooms where she was the only black woman at the table, and often the youngest. She built her reputation quietly but relentlessly, turning struggling companies into billion-dollar successes. Investors trusted her instincts. Employees admired her discipline. Competitors respected her power. By the time this flight was booked, she wasn't just a CEO. She was the CEO. Her firm controlled billions in capital, including major stakes in transportation, tech, and infrastructure. Every move she made rippled across industries. And that morning, she was headed to finalize a funding decision that would reshape the future of a major airline. But none of that was visible as she walked through the airport. All anyone saw was a black woman traveling alone, dressed elegantly but simply, boarding first class with quiet confidence. She didn't flash status. She didn't demand attention. She just took her seat, opened her laptop, and prepared for another high-stakes day. What she didn't know was that someone had already decided she looked out of place. And in a matter of minutes, the success she had built over decades would be reduced to a single, dangerous assumption. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't loud. It was subtle. A flight attendant paused beside her seat longer than necessary. A tight smile. A glance at her boarding pass. Then another employee appeared. They whispered. Looked back at her. Looked at the seat number again. She felt it. That familiar shift in the air. The one she had experienced in luxury boutiques, in private clubs, in boardrooms before people recognized her name. The silent question, is she supposed to be here? Minutes later, 2 security officers stepped onto the plane. They didn't scan the entire cabin. They didn't check rows randomly. They walked with purpose, straight down the aisle, eyes locked on her. Conversations around her began to fade into uncomfortable silence. A few passengers pulled out their phones. Her heart didn't race. It hardened. They asked for her ticket. She handed it over calmly. First class. Paid in full. Confirmed weeks ago. It wasn't enough. Their voices were controlled but firm. There had been a concern. A report. Someone felt uncomfortable. No details. No explanation. Just vague words wrapped in authority. Humiliation doesn't always arrive with shouting. Sometimes it comes quietly, forcing you to gather your things while strangers avoid your eyes. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, but her posture remained steady. She had learned long ago that anger would only be used against her. As she stepped into the aisle, someone muttered, "What did she do?" That question hung in the air. Outside the aircraft door, the tone shifted. The politeness disappeared. Now the implication was heavier. They needed to verify her identity. Needed to ensure everything checked out. Ensure what? Her driver's license was examined. Her executive credentials scrolled through on her phone. LinkedIn profile. Company website. Press features. Awards. The officer's expressions began to change, but not to apology. To discomfort. One of them stepped aside to make a call. Inside the terminal, passengers were still boarding. The flight was delayed now. Rumors were spreading online. A short video clip, just seconds of her being escorted off, was already circulating. And then something else happened. Her phone buzzed. Not with sympathy. Not with outrage. With a message from her chief of staff. The airline's name was in the subject line. Attached were documents outlining a pending $5 billion funding agreement, capital her firm was preparing to allocate within the quarter. Capital that would stabilize the airline's expansion plans for the next decade. The same airline now questioning whether she belonged in seat 2A. Security was still speaking, explaining procedure, policy, protocol. But the power dynamic had shifted. They thought they were investigating a passenger. They were confronting the person who could decide whether their company survived the year. And as another executive from her firm began calling her phone, one realization settled in. This wasn't just about embarrassment anymore. It was about consequences, and the airline had no idea what was about to land. The call ended, and for the first time since security had approached her seat, she spoke. Not loudly, not emotionally, just clearly. She asked for the airline's senior operations manager. At first, there was hesitation, confusion, then urgency. Within minutes, the tone in the hallway shifted from suspicion to panic. Suits replaced uniforms. Apologies replaced accusations. But the damage had already been done. Passengers were still watching through the aircraft windows. Phones were still recording. Online, the clip had exploded, millions of views climbing by the minute. The narrative was forming in real time. A black woman removed from first class under security concerns. Now the executives stood in front of her, faces pale, voices careful. They explained it was a misunderstanding, a procedural error, an overreaction. But she had heard those words before. Misunderstanding never seems to happen to everyone equally. She looked past them, through the glass wall, at the plane she was supposed to be on. The same airline that had spent months negotiating for her firm's capital. The same company depending on that $5 billion infusion to avoid massive layoffs and stabilize their stock. And in that moment, the humiliation crystallized into something sharper. This wasn't just about her seat. It was about every time she had been questioned in spaces she had earned. Every silent doubt. Every extra credential required to prove she belonged. Her phone buzzed again. The board was waiting for her decision. All it would take was one instruction. One signature withheld. The executives kept talking. About optics, about partnerships, about long-term relationships. But she wasn't listening anymore. Because now the power sat entirely in her hands. And she had to decide. Would this be another moment swallowed quietly, or the one that changed everything? She didn't raise her voice. She didn't make a scene. She simply made a decision. Within hours, her firm released a formal statement. The $5 billion funding agreement was suspended indefinitely pending a full investigation into discriminatory practices within the airline. Markets reacted instantly. The company's stock dipped. News outlets picked up the viral footage. What began as a quiet act of humiliation at Seat 2A became a national conversation about bias, profiling, and who gets questioned in spaces of privilege. Publicly, the airline apologized. Internally, executives scrambled. Diversity reviews were announced. Policies were rewritten. Mandatory bias training was implemented. But none of it erased the moment she stood in that aisle, reduced from CEO to suspect because of how she looked. She eventually boarded another flight that day. She closed the deal elsewhere. Business moved forward. But something had shifted. For her, it was no longer just about success. It was about visibility. About using power not just to build wealth, but to challenge systems that quietly humiliate people every day without cameras rolling. Because the truth is, most stories like this don't involve billion-dollar leverage. Most people pulled aside, questioned, or removed on boards waiting on their decision. They just have to endure it. Silently. This wasn't just about one airline. It was about a reflex that still exists, the instinct to doubt, to suspect, to otherize. And it forces a question we can't ignore. If power hadn't been in her hands that day, would anyone have listened?